Hello, hope you're doing well, and welcome back, finally, to Concept Corner, a series which has somehow bafflingly become one of the most highly requested things on my channel, which is pretty wild to say the least. I definitely didn't expect this kind of reception when I first started making these videos, but pretty much every time I upload a new video now, there'll be comments underneath it like, when's the next installment of Concept Corner? It's been ages, we want to hear more about it, and that's in no way something I'm complaining about, by the way. If anything, I'm just blown away by how much love you guys keep showing for this little video series that definitely feels very self-indulgent to me. And also genuinely terribly sorry that it's taken me this long to get back into it and make another episode. This is still honestly one of my favorite video series to get to work on, but unfortunately sometimes you just can't avoid life and work stuff kind of getting in the way. But I expect that's something that you guys can all understand, and hopefully this is going to be a case of better late than never. Although having said that, I should probably admit that I am a little bit anxious, I suppose, that because it's been such a while since the last one of these, and because this video has been like so highly requested that it might not live up to expectation somehow. I don't know, there's like a weird sense of imposter syndrome that's kind of been floating over my head while trying to put this video together, I think. But I'm going to be trying to squash that daunting feeling and just dive right back into the creative energy of this series and ramble and have a good time with it. And hopefully you guys can have a good time too. Anyway, with that little moment of emotional vulnerability out of the way, dreadfully embarrassing, I do apologize. Today, as I think I might have mentioned last time around, I am indeed going to be doing one more episode about Heartless, which is an original story concept that I've already covered various aspects of in my previous Concept Corner videos so far, which I would really recommend going and checking out if you haven't already, because I promise the context will be very, very helpful in understanding just pretty much anything I'm going to be saying in this one, so gonna put that on screen somewhere right about now. More specifically anyway, today I wanted to talk about another thing that you guys have sent me a lot of comments and questions and theories about after the past couple of episodes, which is the overall magic and power system in the world of Heartless, and going into a bit more detail about my ideas for some of the protagonists' powers in particular. So without further ado, because you guys have definitely waited long enough already, let's get started. Alrighty, so as is sometimes the way of things, I figured that before jumping into today's main bulk of character artwork, it might be a good idea to give you guys a quick visual example of how the power system in Heartless would generally work overall, or at least how it would work based on what I've been imagining so far. Because the very nature of anything that's included in these Concept Corner videos is that it's still just in concept and very much subject to change in the future. But for now, as it stands, in the world of Heartless, the crux of the story revolves around magic, the people who wield it, and the people who want to eradicate it. And the people in the world of Heartless come in three general varieties. The vast majority of the population, from everyday civilians to members of the jury to royalty and beyond, have no magical ability and nothing to do with magic whatsoever. A very small percentage of people, however, are born with innate magical abilities, which oftentimes manifests in a way that is unique to the person who wields them. Magic doesn't manifest in these people for any hereditary or genetic reason, which means that it's not really something that can be predicted. It's just the completely random way that certain people come into the world. And then on the flip side, there also exists an even smaller handful of people who wield twisted anti-magic abilities that are imprinted upon them later in life. This particular branch of ability is exceedingly rare and is limited solely to the members of the jury's Wonders division, who I talked about in a previous episode. And it's probably worth mentioning, I'm well aware that a lot of you guys were kind of questioning why these big bad villain people would be using very magical sounding abilities to try and eradicate magic, because that sounded awfully hypocritical of them. And to that I would just love to say, yeah, it does sound quite hypocritical, doesn't it? Can't imagine that, a villain being hypocritical. In this day and age? No. Silly goofiness aside, the main difference to bear in mind is that magic is a completely naturally occurring part of the person who wields it from the day that they're born, even if it might take until a little later in life to fully manifest. And then curses, like the ones that this sort of Wonders division tend to use, are a warped, unnatural power that I'm thinking at the moment it might be fun if they maybe even come at a cost and take a toll on the body that hosts them. Anyway, that's the basic gist of the power system, so let's get on to the character-specific stuff. Alrighty, so initially I wasn't entirely sure how to go about kind of structuring this video, since I did at least mention a little bit about how these guys' powers might work back when I first drew them. Actually, I think what it is that I wasn't quite sure how to go about getting into more detail and explaining how all of these magic ideas might work while still making it make sense. But no better way to do something than by doing it, I suppose. So I think what I'm going to try and do is break down what each of these guys' powers would be called, vaguely how they would work, and what kind of shonen manga style movesets they might have, as well as some of the inspirations and themes that I had in mind while trying to figure them out. So right out of the gate here, we're going to start off with the main character himself, Heartless. I can't fully remember what I might have already mentioned when I last drew him in a video, so as a general reminder of his character type for both you guys and myself, he is a helpful, high-energy undead fellow who works for an odd jobs office, and who has to replenish the limited supply of magic that keeps him alive in place of a heart by absorbing power from the world around him. I do remember I did draw him with these little kind of ghosties the first time around, but I don't think I had the chance to fully expand on how they might work specifically, mostly because at the time I actually hadn't really figured out how I wanted them to work. But I have a pretty good idea of it now. This time around, I really wanted to lean a bit more into that whole absorbing energy from the world around him concept, and think about how it could be made into more of a cool plot hook that could also keep any potential readers of the story curious to see how his power might evolve as the story goes on, and what new forms it might take depending on the situations that Heartless finds himself in. Because I know for me at least, that's definitely one of my favorite aspects of any shonen manga, and kind of the whole shonen manga genre as a whole. Like, getting to see the different ways that a character's unique fighting style and moves might level up and change and adapt as they get stronger is, I don't know, there's something about it that's very, very compelling and fun to kind of see unfold on the page. I tried out a couple of different potential names for what Heartless's power could be called, everything from Grave Robber to Grave Borrower to a few others that I can't even recall at this point, but tentatively in my notes at the moment, Heartless's personal brand of magic is going by the name Hungry Ghoul. And out of all the powers that I'm going to be talking about today, I do feel like this one probably has the weirdest name at the moment, or at least it's the only name with this kind of vibe to it, I suppose. I do like it. I feel like it's definitely appropriate for what his power is and what it does, and it definitely allows the names of any special moves he might have to all have a fun overall theme that connects them, like something about teeth and eating and biting, that kind of thing. There's a lot of fun puns that you can make with that. But yeah, in any case, Hungry Ghoul is a cute name, it's a fun name, it feels very festive. It just also stands out to me as a bit of an outlier from the rest of the protagonist's power sort of names for some reason. As for what Heartless's Hungry Ghoul power can do, anyway, I'm generally listing it as something along the lines of being the power to borrow or to adapt or convert, that kind of thing. The basic rundown is that, like I say, Hungry Ghoul allows him to absorb energy from the world around him and repurpose it, to either maintain his own life force or to cast spells and generally use it in a fight. But also, and this is the most recent idea that I've had about Heartless's magic, and it is by far the aspect that I've had the most fun thinking about, I really love the idea of his ghouls taking on the attributes of whatever it is they consume, whether it's a natural phenomena or even somebody else's magic. That's not to say that Heartless could send his ghouls out to chomp on someone and he'd suddenly instantly be able to wield their magic exactly as that original wielder would be able to, but rather that, as you can probably tell by now based on this drawing here, it would only be his ghouls that would take on those certain properties based on what they've just absorbed. So then what Heartless would end up having to do is wield these little orbs of affected magic that he could then kick around and yeet in the direction that he wants to apply them, and then he just kind of has to wait and see what happens on impact. Temporary copycatting powers like this are some of my favorite ones to see in the stories that I read myself, because they just allow so much room for creativity and unexpected clutch moments. But spinning it this way, wherein Heartless would be trying to physically throw these raw bundles of magic at his enemies instead of immediately mastering precise control over any given power that he might want to take, felt like a decent way of making sure that it wouldn't be too overpowered or too generic, while also making it feel like a better fit for such a high-energy character specifically. The idea of him kicking them around in particular was mostly inspired by his outfit, which looks rather football kit adjacent, and for this illustration I even pulled up some panels from one of my favourite sports manga to use as a pose reference. As you can see, I only included two ghouls in this one that are taking on different properties, namely a peachy coloured one and a frosty one in the style of two of his friends. But I like to think that Heartless's own unchanged magic would still take on this black electricity kind of appearance, both to match his overall aesthetic and the kind of heart monitor defibrillator kind of logo on his outfit. And one other thought that I've been having is that maybe it could even be that when the story very first begins, Heartless's magic doesn't actually have a form yet, it's not taken on this electrical shape, but then he could absorb something during the first chapter which would make it take this shape for the first time. I kept trying to think of some low-level, non-magical enemy that could possibly zap him with an electric weapon or something, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, well, maybe Heartless just gets struck by lightning, because that would be very Frankenstein of him, and I kinda love that. But yeah, with all of this talk of how other characters' magic might affect his powers anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and move on to another character. So next up, we have the piece that actually ended up being my favourite out of all the artworks I drew for today's video, and it is of none other than the glamorous magician, Alchemy Valentine. I think I spoke a fair bit about Alchemy's magic back in my first Heartless video, but as a refresher, Alchemy's magic is called Alchemy, and I would describe it as the power to perform alchemy. Very much a does what it says on the tin kind of ability at first glance, but it does have some fun limitations and unique aspects to it. Namely the fact that alchemy can pretty much only transform inanimate materials, with the only living being that she can transform being himself. I have been thinking that their magic might also need to be bound to some form of equivalent exchange as well. So for instance, while they mostly use their magic to alter the scenery around them, they would only be able to turn any given material into the same amount of something else, or change the shape of it while maintaining its original mass. Alchemy is a character that I really enjoy, and one whose backstory I've probably got the most detail figured out for at the moment, because it has quite a large influence on not only their morals and their personality, but also a lot of aspects regarding their magic, from the way it's named to the way she uses it. I think I touched on Alchemy's backstory a tiny bit when I was talking about the side character Moira, or at the very least I remember mentioning that Moira played quite a large role in Alchemy's backstory, and that is because after Alchemy's magic manifested at a very young age and they were found wandering the streets of Brightbarrow lost and unable to remember their name or even their own face, Moira took them in. There are definitely a lot more details I would need to flesh out, but to make a long story short, despite the fact that Alchemy is an incredibly confident in who they are kind of character by the time the story begins and Heartless meets them, there would be a lot of elements in her backstory that revolve around finding themselves. In a way, I think he'd see a bit of himself in Heartless, or at least resonate quite a bit with Heartless's whole amnesia situation. I do love a good character parallel, so it really is a ton of fun for me to think about the similar narrative themes that they both share between their respective pasts and presents. Alchemy is also a character who embodies a lot of self-love, which I love for them, but I also like to think that there is a degree of vanity mixed in there as well, which they also lean into with absolutely zero shame. Like, they went from being a lost kid with no face to a genderqueer femme fatale who not only named themselves, but then also went on to name their own magic after themselves, because that's just how much they love themselves. And you know what? Good for them. I think that's pretty cool. Evidently, Alchemy is also one of the most visibly loud and proudly queer members of the cast as well, although all of the protagonists in Heartless are indeed LGBT in some kind of way. And maybe this is more of a side note than anything, but even though I do completely understand why sometimes people can get a bit tired of the genderqueer character in any given media being assigned shapeshifter by default, I can, if nothing else, at least admit that as a trans person myself, I know dang well that anytime somebody asks what superpower I would have, shapeshifting is always the immediate answer. Well, shapeshifting and being able to make shadow clones so that I could get more work done, although I'm pretty sure that one's more of a me thing than a trans thing, but anyway, the point is this a character type and power combo that's a little bit overdone? Maybe. But as long as it's handled properly, is it still fun? Absolutely. In any case, what with Alchemy being a shape-shifting showman, I wanted to lean a bit more into that flamboyant energy while drawing them this time around. Namely by showing off a little hint at the fact that Alchemy's outfits are not gender presentation locked by any means, and by trying to figure out what kind of visuals might work for depicting any instance of them shifting between their favourite appearances. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realised that I actually had no idea how to depict someone transforming in a non-animated medium, so it was definitely a challenge that I wanted to try my hand at. To that end, I decided to draw Alchemy in a taking a bow kind of pose. Because of their day job, I've always imagined Alchemy's magic having a confetti and smoke and generally very stage magic kind of look to it. Although over time I decided to use flower petals in place of actual confetti whenever I draw them sort of doing a flourish while using their magic, to stand in as a kind of homage to the name that they had when I first designed them as a kid, which was Alchemy Rose. And actually, having said that, I literally realized while recording this that these rose petals actually do work on another, much more silly level as well, which is that they make me think of Team Rocket from Pokemon. And now that I'm looking at this picture and thinking of that, I realize that Alchemy does have a lot of Jesse and James energy, both of them, all at once. And that is a completely unconscious point of inspiration, but absolutely one that I'll just take because that is so silly. Anyway, I used a couple of Clip Studio brushes to show a bit of terrain and brickwork being uprooted as Alchemy makes all the world a stage, so to speak, and wrapped their other forms in a ribbon of smoke that gets fainter and fainter as it goes further into the background. Figuring out the visuals for the middlemost one was definitely a challenge, like I say, but the composition made everything really satisfying to puzzle together. While sketching for all of today's artworks, I tried to give them all a pose that would look really cool as an anime figure. That was kind of the main inspiration behind all of these action shots that you're going to see come together here. And as complicated as this one definitely was to put together, I really think it hit the mark on that front. Anyway, with that, I think it's about time to move on from the character with today's most intricate artwork to the character with what may well be today's most intricate magical moveset. Alrighty, so stepping up to the plate next is the team's resident strongman, Flint Solvig. Or Solveig. A couple of folks have commented with different pronunciations of that surname, so I do apologize if the way that I say it sounds off or completely incorrect in any way. But either way, Flint is a competitive martial artist and a witch who can manifest and manipulate flames. I'm not fully settled on a name for his magic yet, because essentially it is just fire, and there are only so many ways that you can really designate that, but I think the main contender name-wise at the moment is probably combustion, because to me at least that definitely sounds like something that's both fiery and punchy at the same time. But if you guys have any alternate suggestions of things that you think might work in a similar kind of punchy, fiery name sort of way, then I would love to hear them. Having said that though, the main thing that I wanted to talk about today isn't actually Flint's fire-focused magic itself, because truthfully, that isn't the most interesting part of his fighting style. Instead, in true anime fashion, Flint makes use of a secret technique with a much longer name, which allows him to harness the power of his flame magic far more effectively. And it's that secret technique of his which makes up the basis for his entire fighting style as a whole. It's also the aspect that I tend to really focus on when thinking of how he might use his powers in combat. This secret technique of his also makes Flint somewhat of a, maybe not an outlier, but certainly a unique case as far as the way that he views the world and the magic within it is concerned. And I mean that in both a literal and metaphorical sense. The name of this technique anyway is, and again, excuse my pronunciation in advance, the Solvig School of the Sunroad's Wandering Arts. Like I said, it's a bit of a mouthful, but when you're working on a shonen-inspired manga concept like this, you kinda have to include a ridiculously long move name in there somewhere, because when else are you gonna get the chance, you know what I mean? In any case, these wandering arts of his are a collection of entirely non-magical martial arts techniques, which were actually developed by Flint's own family. And for all the people who picked up on the meaning of Flint's surname last time around, you might also notice that the name of his family's school is, hopefully, because again I'm not too great with languages, a pretty much direct translation of what his surname means. So essentially he comes from the Solvig School of Solvig. With all this talk of his family's martial arts school though, I realized that I don't actually think I really touched on Flint's backstory when I last drew him, since I still hadn't fully figured it out back then. But needless to say, his powers are another set of character abilities that are quite intrinsically tied into his personal backstory. So this is probably as good a time as any to get into a few details. Although again, it might be a good idea to bear in mind that some of the things I'm going to say this time around might sound a bit different to what I said about Flint previously, because I can't fully remember what I might have said previously. So yeah. Anyway, what I'm thinking for Flint's backstory at the moment is that Flint's family are the proprietors of a small, nomadic martial arts school, and Flint grew up learning his family's techniques, going from being a student to an almost fully fledged instructor. At the moment, I'm also quite keen on the idea that when he first meets the Heartless team in the story, it's because at that point he's on a sort of solo journey of self-discovery that's something of like a traditional graduation pilgrimage in his family's school. Like a kind of, you cannot fully understand all of these techniques until you fully understand yourself kind of deal. Or maybe it's even more like there's one final technique that he still needs to learn in order to be considered a fully fledged graduate of this martial arts style, but it's not something that can be taught, and instead he has to go out into the world and find it himself by way of just kinda figuring it out. And you know, he's a good son and older brother who wants to make his family proud, so off a-wanderin' does he go. It's at this point that I also really want to mention the inspiration behind the entire School of the Sun Road fighting style here, because it really gets my brain buzzing. So the overall theme of it is this concept of direction. Specifically, it has this overarching visual and kind of narrative theme of crossroads and compasses and using the stars to guide your way. And this carries right through in every aspect of what I have worked out for Flint and his moveset so far, from the fact that his family runs a wandering school, to the names of his moves, to the fact that he has that four-pointed sun tattoo on his back, which, as you can see, I thought would be really cool if it could glow and burn when he's really getting fired up, so to speak. At the moment, I'm thinking that Flint would have 4 main moves called paths, one to represent each direction on a compass, and each one would be named after either a star or a time of day. Obviously, each of these paths would also have a different function, but I think my favorite one to think about is, I think I'm just gonna go ahead and say the full name for the sake of full tilt goofy anime energy, but yeah, my favorite one is Solvig School of the Sun Road's Wandering Arts, North Path, Polaris. And that felt both cool and embarrassing to say out loud, but I can't say that it wasn't fun. Anyway, what that one can do is allow Flint to see the flow of energy in the world around him, be it natural or magical. The reason this is probably my favorite though is because of the limitations that come with it, which are that this skill can only be maintained by standing completely still with your eyes closed, which means that as strategically valuable as it may be, it would also risk Flint turning himself into a sitting duck in the middle of a busy battlefield. There's also another path that I'm still kinda workshopping, which I keep thinking should be limited by only being usable while Flint is holding his breath, which is also fun thematically since fire can't last long without air, and Flint is a boxer, and there's a whole thing about like anaerobic exercise there, and this is why I said that Flint's moveset really gets my brain buzzing, because it all connects in a really fun way and I have a really hard time shutting up about it. Anyway, I feel like I might have talked about Flint a bit too much already, evidently, but before I move along, I do also want to mention, because if I'm remembering correctly, I think this might have been something that a couple of people may have been understandably concerned about, because all too often, characters of color like Flint can end up being, again, defaulted to aggressive or violent roles within their stories. But please rest assured that despite how he might look in this particular illustration, because these are meant to be action poses and there aren't really a ton of ways to go about throwing a flaming uppercut without looking at least a little bit heated, but in terms of Flint's actual personality and characterization and fully fleshed out role within the story of Heartless, which obviously is impossible to convey within the limited amount of time I have in these videos, he is actually intended to be the most calm and patient and level-headed, like steadfast kind of character out of the entire team of protagonists. And he is also in no way like the kind of fella who is going to go out looking to get into fights all the time. He's just real strong, but he knows how to wield it. However, in the interests of being fully transparent here, and also because I at least think that there is a legitimate reason, which I'll get onto in a minute, for including this as part of Flint's personal narrative, I do tend to imagine that he wasn't always that way, and that when he was a really young kid, he may have had a much more fiery temper, which was then accompanied by a fiery, powerful magical ability which terrified him. He didn't understand it, which meant that he wasn't able to control it, which only left him feeling even more terrified, and so the cycle continued. At least until, through a lot of trial and error and hard work and help from his family, he slowly learned how to ground himself and manage both his emotions and his magic in a way that worked for him. Not to bore you guys with some of my own real-life backstory here, but I did personally experience a lot of the exact kind of emotional dysregulation that I have in mind for Flint's backstory in my own childhood, due to the fact that I had undiagnosed and therefore completely untreated ADHD, which, to put it another way, meant that I was a volatile youngster. So, even though I do realize it is a pretty on-the-nose metaphor, I feel like having Flint be this character who, by the time the story has already started, still definitely has room to grow, but who already has grown past that same kind of frantic fear of an intrinsic part of yourself that you don't yet understand and don't yet have the words to convey, but which makes you feel so intensely, and into this really reliable and mindful, like, steady and self-assured person who is completely at peace with himself. I don't know, there's just something about it that really resonates with me and feels very compelling both as a person with ADHD and as a trans person. And hopefully it might resonate with some of you guys as well, or at least at the baseline just make some kind of sense. But yeah, I do definitely realize that it is the kind of backstory that would absolutely need to be told well in order to be read with as much sincerity and feeling as I want it to convey and not run the risk of falling into bad trope territory. But at least to my mind, Flint is the kind of role model character that I really would have loved to see in some of the stories that I read growing up. And yeah, I really do hope that I can manage to do that for not only Flint, but all of these characters someday. That'd be neat. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and move along from one wielder of extreme temperatures to another now, because it's time to take a look at the burgeoning magical repertoire of Eira Hale. In case you don't remember from last time, Eira's role in the story is that of a high-ranking royal guard from a wintry witch-hunting kingdom, who lends his services as a swordsman to the protection of his best friend, the kingdom's prince. Eira is also a bit of a late bloomer on a handful of different fronts, but we'll get into those later, who, despite being one of the older members of the main cast, is actually the character who is the least experienced with exerting control over his own magic, having suppressed it for pretty much his whole life. While we're on the subject of Eira's magic, the name I'm using for it at the moment is Snowsmith. And much like how Flint's magic can basically be summed up with the word fire, Eira's magic can pretty much be summed up with the word ice. Or at least that's the kind of summary that Eira himself would probably end up giving if he was asked to describe his magic at the point at which he first joins the story, since at that point in time, that's pretty much all he would really know about it, after having rejected it and then left it unrefined for so long. But as the story would go on, and as Eira would figure out more about himself and the kind of witch he wants to be, or indeed whether he would want to accept the fact that he is a witch in the first place after having hidden the truth of himself away for so long, he would discover that there is much more to magic than meets the eye, and in his case, much more precise ways to wield it just waiting to be discovered under layers and layers of raw, unshaped elemental force. It's at this point that I would love to share at least another tiny little tidbit about Eira's backstory, because, as is kind of proving to be the way of things so far, it does have a decent amount of sway over how he would finally end up learning to utilize his magic in a way that feels natural to him. So I've talked a little bit before about how Eira grew up as a bit of a thug on the streets of his kingdom, at least until the prince befriended him and signed him up for the royal guard. But before any of that, Eira lived with his father, who was a highly skilled blacksmith. Now, going into any specific detail about what could have happened to lead Eira from a life spent forging weapons with his dad to being a sword-wielding punk with no home to speak of is definitely encroaching upon major spoiler territory, so I don't think I can quite do that. But the concise version is basically that at the end of the day, Eira Hale is a swordsman who has weapon making in his blood. And even though this, I swear to God, was completely unintentional and I only realized the similarity after the fact, you can still absolutely call me out as a massive Princess Bride stan for that one. Man, you know that feeling when your favorite movie of all time just has an iron grip around your subconscious? Anyway, all of that is to say that after what would probably be a good while spent only really knowing how to send out huge waves of ice Todoroki style, a good amount of soul-searching and lessons in self-acceptance, as well as a number of run-ins with a surprising number of people's favorite bastard man, Lance, I would really love to see Eira harkening back to the kinds of crafts he learned from his dad and using his magic to forge full-on swords and shields and even entire suits of armor out of ice. It's another concept that really sets my mind off running with ideas because there are just so many visual metaphors and combinations and narrative parallels that spring to mind between the repetitive molten hammering of traditional blacksmithing and then the strength of will that Eira would need to power his way through a tough fight and keep forging and refreezing these icy constructs again and again and again and trying to build them back up faster and sharper and stronger every time they're shattered until they become completely indestructible. I think the way I ended up drawing him here would be more of a middle of the learning curve kind of level of spellcasting for Eira. Like, there's still some of that raw-edged roughness to the craftsmanship and the way that this kind of batch of equipment is erupting from the ground, instead of it being something really intricate and highly refined, like I imagine he'd probably be more capable of towards the end of the series. But it was still really fun to draw him midway through making a bunch of equipment like this. Not to mention decking him out with a massive shield like this. I've only ever really thought about Eira using swords, but this gives him some real defender of the crown paladin kind of energy. I'm really here for it. Before I finish up with Eira, I also wanted to mention another idea for him that's more of a fun world building and potential character development kind of thing rather than anything particularly backstory or magic related. So I know I've talked previously about how whenever a new member will join the adventuring party, to put it in Dungeons & Dragons terms, they'd be welcomed into the Odd Jobs office by way of Alchemy and Moira patchworking together a new room for them and sticking it onto the rest of the building. Well, I thought a bit more about that. And I decided that, it might be really fun and provide a lot of rather intriguing opportunities for meaningful interactions and emotional character growth between certain folks if the Mojo team only ran out of space and started having to build more rooms for people after Eira has already joined. Because there could totally still be enough room for him at the point in time at which he joins the team. It's just that that room could also be Flint's. And they could be roommates. Albeit begrudgingly as far as Eira is concerned, because the two of them did not get off on the right foot, to put it lightly. But hey, if they're going to be roomies, then that ought to give them plenty of time to talk it out. But putting all jokes and the concept of Eira slowly figuring out his big gay feelings aside, I do really love to imagine the kinds of genuinely deep emotional conversations that Flint and Eira could end up having with each other as characters and as people. because there is, if I do say so myself, a lot of potential there. Like, Eira is the type to be very reluctant to ask for help or even admit that he needs help in the first place, but on the other hand, Flint is very perceptive and would definitely be able to recognize that this grown-ass man that he's now sharing a room with is actually going through a very similarly daunting period of self-discovery to the one that Flint himself would have already experienced while learning to control his own magic during his childhood. I've said it once, I'll say it 1,000 times, but we love thematic opposites and narrative parallels in this house. Anyway, Eira and Flint are a real pair of favorites for me, evidently, to think about, and yeah, hopefully that gives you guys plenty to think about too, so thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So moving right along to the penultimate character for today, or characters if we're being technical, even though they are technically the same person. But yeah, here we have the Phantom Thief who split himself in half with his own magic, Doppel and Glass. Last time around that was all one name that they both shared, but because that left a lot of you guys asking what the second fellow here should be called, I figured that it would probably make a bit more sense to just split the name right down the middle and call the confident original iteration Doppel and the other more timid one Glass. Anyway, Doppel and Glass's magic is called Mirror, and it's another very does what it says on the tin kind of power, because it is essentially the power to mirror things. I talked a bit about how it works last time, so I don't want to run the risk of repeating myself too much here, but yeah, Doppel's magic is pretty much comprised of reflecting and duplicating stuff, as well as a couple of other fun ideas that I've had since last time that could maybe be intermixed with all of that, like using shards of broken glass from his sort of magical mirrors as part of some kind of offensive attack, or even potentially the ability to travel through reflections, whether it's in a glass mirror or through a puddle or something like that. Although that particular idea is one that I'm still not entirely sold on at the moment. At the very least, I might limit it to being something that only Glass could do, since he is a reflection himself. Besides that, in any case, something that I'm not sure whether I've mentioned before, although I feel like I have, at least very briefly, is that because Doppel and Glass are essentially two halves of a whole, the magical power that they wield is also divided between them, and therefore is only half of what it should be, which means that when standing on their own instead of fighting side by side, these two are individually the weakest witches on the entire team of protagonists. They are both well aware of that fact though, and one of the few things that they can both agree on is that self-preservation is a very high priority for them, which is why their default tactic in a fight is to run away by any means necessary. Anyway, that brings me on to the actual thing that I couldn't remember if I'd mentioned before, which is that beyond being thieves, Doppel and Glass are also innovative inventors who can think on the fly, and who can make things that fly, as you can see here. My thinking at the moment is that on the general world-building front, obviously witches are commonly associated with broomsticks, but because of how commonly frowned upon witchcraft is within the world of Heartless, they wouldn't exactly be easy things to come by, least of all in the city that Doppel and Glass come from, because I have been thinking a bit more about that as well. So Doppel and Glass come from a steampunk-themed city, right? And I realized that an old-fashioned, heavily mechanical place like that would be a prime location for not only a massive jury stronghold, but also a general populace of civilians who are also very strongly opposed to magic and very supportive of the jury's quest to eradicate all witches. A point of view which is of course thanks in no small part to the powerful presence and influence that the jury would have in this city. I've also been thinking that it might make for a cool set piece if the city itself was really isolated and was either built on top of a huge, mining pit that descends into the earth, or made up of a huge tower that corkscrews up into the clouds. Either way, the rich and powerful people of the city would live higher up, while the down-on-their-luck folk like Doppel would be stuck in the lower levels, working, or in Doppel's case thieving, their way through their days, never making quite enough money to make their way up and out into the world beyond the city walls. And because of all of that, not only would Doppel and Glass want nothing more than to escape from their hometown and make their way to the magical refuge of the Magistratum, but they would also have no way to do so. Which is why I'm thinking that Doppel, in all of his hot-headedness, would decide that he and Glass need to use their engineering expertise to set about trying to build a mechanical broomstick completely from scratch out of whatever scrap that he and Glass are able to steal from around the city. They'd probably cause a lot of trouble around the city in the process, which would also earn them a less than favorable reputation. I like to think that there'd be some kind of final essential ingredient or otherwise magical MacGuffin that would be needed to complete their masterpiece though, and that they would need to pull off some kind of heist in a jury museum or something in order to get it. Hell, that could even be the event through which these two are introduced into the story. I also thought a bit more about how other aspects of their backstory might pan out, and I decided that instead of splitting himself in half completely by accident like I'd imagined previously, I thought it might be both more interesting and something that would give Doppel even more motivation to want to leave this steampunky city, as well as lend a bit more angst to his character as a whole, if he actually created Glass on purpose. although I do expect that Glass's very contrasting personality as well as the fact that the spell was irreversible would still have been something of an unexpected hiccup. The reason behind that change, or at least the idea behind why maybe I'll make that change, is that maybe Doppel wasn't always roughing it in the lower levels of the city, and that maybe he actually came from a rich family who lived higher up. Specifically, a very rich family who regularly donated a bunch of funds to the jury. After his magic manifested, I'm not sure whether Doppel would have been told by his parents to hide his magic by whatever means necessary because they thought it would be an embarrassment of some kind, or if they would have disowned him on the spot, or if Doppel maybe would have even overheard his parents talking about turning him over to the jury to try and have him cured, in heavy air quotes, and then just ran away from home of his own accord in order to prevent them ever getting the chance. Either way, it would lead Doppel to resolve that from then on, there's nobody he could trust but himself, which is why he would have that gotta look out for number one kind of mentality, and why he ended up using his mirror magic in the first place to literally make a duplicate of himself that he could rely on. Despite how miserable that backstory might sound though, Doppel and Glass are definitely still intended to be written as comedic relief kind of characters, albeit at least semi-capable ones. But even so, oftentimes a comedic character can be made so much more compelling and interesting when they have a little bit of pain buried under their puns. Not to mention the fact that when a serious character gets serious, it can sometimes feel par for the course and detract from the overall intended impact. But when a goofy character gets serious, it can carry so much more gravity, which is something that I really love to see in the stories that I read. And speaking of gravity, that actually makes for a surprisingly relevant segue into our final character artwork of the day. So last but certainly not least, we have River Dial, a character who specializes in making both the most and the least of things. Now, before I even get into explaining quite what I mean by that, I'm going to preface this by saying that River's magic and the way that it works is probably the one I'm going to have the hardest time trying to articulate in any kind of concise, coherent way. It's certainly up there as far as having one of the most complex definitions goes, so yeah, I'm just going to try and do my best, and hopefully you guys can bear with me. So River is a medic, potentially a medic in training, in the independent nation of which is known as the Magistratum. And last time around, I described her powers as the ability to amplify things, specifically the ability to apply that amplification to anything other than herself. Now, that limitation still remains true, she cannot use her magic to affect her own body, but I don't know if just calling it amplification is still the best way to specifically describe how her magic would actually affect the world around her. I think the easiest way to describe it would be in direct comparison with how Alchemy's magic works. So while Alchemy's magic allows them to manipulate physical materials or to affect that which is tangible, River's magic would allow her to manipulate the non-physical, or to manipulate that which is intangible or unseen. Which is to say that she would have the power to affect the unseen forces that affect physical things, either to increase them or decrease them at her own will. It's definitely quite a powerful ability in concept, so I'm not sure whether it would need to be limited to only being able to affect things that she's touched, or if it could just be line of sight based, or maybe if it would even work on more of an area of effect kind of level. The way I picture things going at the moment anyway is that when River first joins the team, her understanding of her own magic would be much like how Eira's was during his own introduction, which is to say that at that point, River could only perceive one small part of what her magic is capable of, rather than its much more intricate potential. And that could be for any number of reasons, but most likely it could just end up being down to her superiors in the Magistratum's medical sector assuming, through no fault of their own, that River had just some kind of basic healing magic, since, given the kind of work that they would do in the medical sector, that's all that it would have looked like. Oh, also this is a partial topic jump here, but a lot of you guys ended up suggesting names for the Magistratum Guard from River's backstory last time around, and for whatever reason, a whole bunch of people ended up suggesting the name Brooke. I really love that for her individually, I think it really suits her design, but I also really love that in terms of the whole Bodies of Water theme, it's a perfect match for River's name. That is super cute, and I love it, and I thank you all very, very much for your suggestions. I think it's safe to say that that character is definitely going to end up being called Brooke. But yeah, back to River anyway. As River travels with the rest of the heroes and broadens her horizons, because I imagine that River is, like, she would almost treat magic as a science, as kind of ironic as that sounds, but like, she would be a very studious person with a very particular way of thinking, and that way of thinking would kind of be along the lines of, if 1 + 1 = 2, then this plus that will equal this magical reaction, and that's why that magic works in that way. Kind of like she would automatically apply some kind of formula to the magic that she sees in order to make it make sense. And if she were to come across something that didn't add up in a way that she could make that kind of sense of, then it would be quite frustrating for her to try and wrap her head around, because it just doesn't quite add up, so to speak. but ultimately River would need to learn to look beyond what she sees, or look beyond her kind of logical way of thinking at least, and embrace the more difficult to define nature of her own power in order to fully harness it, as frustrating of a learning curve that might be. And before you ask, yes, this is another instance of a power that is at least partially inspired by what it can be like to be neurodiverse or have ADHD, because I know in my case certainly there are certain things that don't add up, but I have to understand them a certain way in order to do them, so... But yeah, if we're talking about actual examples of how she might use her magic to do cool things, I think maybe this is an example that I've given before back when I first mentioned the idea of River having prosthetic legs in the first place. But as an example, River could use her magic to alter the effects of gravity or velocity on her prosthetics to make them lighter or heavier in a fight and pack more of a punch. And this is more of a new thought, but maybe she could even realize that that's something that she could do in the first place because someone else could try and pick them up for her, and then they're like, oh, these are heavy, how have you been wearing these all day? And because of that, they later realized that River had actually been subconsciously making her prosthetics easier for herself to wear without even realizing, and thus begins the start of her learning that there are plenty more ways for her to use her magic than just making wounds heal a bit faster. For instance, as another example, if she ever had to fight Lorelei, then River could completely dial down the volume of Lorelei's sound-based curse and render it useless. Essentially, velocity, volume, gravity, River would be able to affect all of those kinds of intangible scientific forces and more in a very magically tangible way. I still don't know if I'm phrasing any of this in a way that makes any sense at all, but there is still something inherently fun to think about with River in that she is a character who, almost conversely to how Eira suppressed his magic and didn't want to understand it, River has been using her magic for her entire life and striving to use it better, and yet still doesn't fully understand it as much as she wants to, because it's never been explained to her in a way that actually is true to what it is. I think River's character arc would focus a lot on her learning from the rest of the team, and indeed from the various ways in which she kind of exists as an opposite to a lot of them in certain thematic and backstory related ways, and learning that she can define herself and her own power and then set her own limits to push past, rather than having to accept the definitions and limitations that are given to her by other people, which in and of itself is also kind of a motto that the rest of the team will end up going by in some capacity, whether they know it from the get-go or learn it along the way just like River. In the early stages of trying to figure out the finer mechanics of River's magic anyway, the name I kept calling it by was Increase-Decrease, since even though it wasn't particularly catchy, it was the best way I could think to sum it up in general. But I think it might actually be better if River's magic stayed unnamed within the story, at least until she finally gets a handle on how it works and makes use of it in a way that is entirely her own, at which point she might end up taking a leaf out of Alchemy's Book of Self-Appreciation and name it Dial. Trying to visualize her magic was almost as much of a challenge as it is to try and explain it, because how does one really go about drawing something that's supposed to be affecting things that are invisible? Certainly didn't give myself an easy job here, but I knew that I wanted to follow through with that whole dial theme. So for reference, I pulled up a bunch of those like sound wave, audio level bar graph kind of things that you can see on the radio or on like lo-fi music channels sometimes to use as inspiration, as well as some pictures of a caduceus staff and various iterations of Hermes, the Greek god, since Hermes and his winged boots are commonly associated with medicine, as far as I'm aware anyway. And after putting all of those inspirations onto a mood board, I figured that because River is a nurse, I wanted her magic to take the shape of glowing wings on the heels of her prosthetics, kind of to mimic the boots that Hermes has. Not only because of the medical association, but also because that would imply that they go really fast, and that is potentially something that River could make them do. Originally, I wanted to have them literally in the shape of those kind of audio-level soundwave circles that I'd pulled up as a reference, but I couldn't quite make all of those tiny segmented lines look readable instead of just kind of like a jumbled mess. So what I ended up doing instead was to put a ripple at the middle of the design in order to echo that circular shape, and then draw a bunch of arrows in place of the bar graph lines that I'd been trying to work with previously. It definitely ended up giving everything a better sense of directional flow, and that feels like it's something that would make for a much better visual indicator as to whether River could be using her magic to turn something up or to turn it down. I also imagine there'd be plenty of fun to be had with the magic of the arrows being more curved or jagged or flying all over the place depending on what she'd actually be trying to affect as well. So I definitely count this particular mid-process design change as a happy little accident. Anyhow, that ought to be all of today's pieces just about done. God only knows how long this video has ended up being by now. I feel like I'm absolutely losing my voice, so hopefully I haven't talked your absolute ears off. But yeah, as much as it's been fun to draw all of these action poses, I do think it's about time to take a closer look at how they all turned out. And that is just about it for today. It feels so nice to have been able to dip back into Concept Corner again. I had missed it terribly, so thank you very much for hanging out while I ramble about these characters again. Full disclosure, I would love to do another one of these quite soon, but I am a little bit torn about what the content should be next time. Now that I've drawn all of the heroes using their magic in this one, I don't know whether I should hop onto a new story next time, or if it would be better to carry on down this road of hyperfocus one more time, and do a power-centric episode like this for the villains of Heartless 2, and have that be the official finale of this kind of Heartless Concept Corner saga. I feel like I have this dilemma at the end of every single Concept Corner video so far, and I am so very sorry for that, genuinely. I don't want it to come off as if I'm, like, milking Heartless for all that it's worth, but like I say, you guys have just been very, very enthusiastic about it, and I want to make sure that if you would like to see a little bit more about this particular cast of characters, then you get that. But likewise, if you've had quite enough by now and you'd prefer to move on to a new story, then we can totally do that too. I just very much hope that my indecisiveness on the matter isn't a humongous pain in the neck. I think what I'm probably going to do is put a poll up on my community tab sometime soon so that you guys can actually vote for what you'd like to see next, so keep an eye out for that. But for now anyway, thank you very, very much again for tuning into this one. It's been really nice having you here. Thank you ever so much for your patience as well while I put this one together. They are quite chunky, so it's a bit of a job. And until next time, I hope you'll all keep staying as safe, happy, and healthy as you possibly can.